Good evening, and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson School. I'm Dean Cecilia Rouse. Today, it is my absolute honor to introduce our guest speaker, former Liberian President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, truly one of the leading advocates for freedom, peace, and justice in our time. President Sirleaf's accomplishments and honors are many. She was Africa's first democratically elected female president, serving Liberia from 2006 to 2018. She is known worldwide as a leader in the fight for women's empowerment and democratic rule. In 2011, President Sirleaf received the Nobel Peace Prize, along with two fellow women leaders, Liberian peace activist Lima Bowie and Yemeni human rights activist politician Tawakkol Karman. The Nobel Committee recognized President Sirleaf for, and I quote, securing peace in Liberia, to promoting economic and social development, and to strengthening the position of women, unquote. President Sirleaf is renowned for her efforts following Liberia's decade-long civil war in promoting peace, reconciliation, and recovery. During her 2 terms as president, she erased almost $5 billion of her nation's foreign debt, supervised the swelling of the national budget from $80 million to $516 million at one point, and courting direct foreign investment. Prior to being elected president, she served in the transitional government, chairing the Governance Reform Commission and leading Liberia's anti-corruption reform. And prior to the military coup of 1980, she worked as Liberia's Minister of Finance. In this role, she introduced measures to curb the mismanagement of government finances. She has held prominent positions within the banking industry and at the United Nations. President Sirleaf was elected the first female chairperson of the Economic Community of West African States for a 12-month term in 2016. In 2011, Forbes named her the most powerful woman in Africa. In 2010, Newsweek named her among the 10 best leaders in the world. She is the recipient of the U.S. Medal of Freedom and France's Croix de Légion d'honneur. President Sirleaf is the author of many works on financial development and human rights issues, as well as a memoir, This Child Will Be Great. Please join me in giving President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf a very warm welcome.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Dean Rouse. Dean Rouse, faculty, fellows, students at the Woodrow Wilson School, honored friends, guests of Princeton, my compatriots who happen to be here in the audience. It's a real honor to be here today. I stand before you today, having retired from the presidency of Liberia 6 weeks ago. On January 22nd, Liberia, on that date, saw the first peaceful democratic transfer of presidential power since, you may not believe it, since 1944. The 2017 presidential and legislative elections were a historical marker in the consolidation of post-conflict consolidation of democracy in our country. It was a hard-fought victory and indicative of a broader movement across the continent of Africa towards democracy and accountability. The quest for democracy in Africa is a continuum of the continent's struggle for freedom and liberation. This is a universal quest, unknown in this country also, driven by the human yearning for liberty, justice, equality before the law, equal opportunity, and the pursuit of happiness. Former U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice captures the draw of human being to democracy in her book, Democracy, The Long Road to Freedom, in which she insists that human beings, no matter their station in life, no matter their location, no matter from whence they come, are drawn to the idea that they should determine their own fate. Rice calls democracy the system offering the highest form of human potential, and she notes that in each passing day, sovereignty is dying as a defense against oppression within one's own borders. A recent poll conducted by Afrobarometer found that 7 out of 10 Africans believe democracy is preferable to all other forms of government. As a result, we see increased pressure both for democratization and for accountability in existing African democracies. Recent positive events in the Gambia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Angola, where entrenched leadership has given way, all speak to this positive trend. Africa's trending toward democracy comes at a time when other parts of the world are sliding backwards. China, for example, recently announced the abolishment of term limits, and later this month, the leaders of Russia and Egypt will stand for presidential elections absent any true political opposition. Africans are watching these global concerns as they guard their own progress. Now on to Liberia in our post-conflict consolidation of democracy. The Liberia I took over in 2006 was at a hard-fought battle, a fragile peace, and many years of ruinous civil and regional war. Our citizens were suffering under a collapsed economy, decayed infrastructure, and paralyzed institutions of the state. My administration inherited a crushing debt burden and some 100,000 ex-combatants who had swollen the ranks of vulnerable unemployment to more than 80%. We had to prioritize. We sought to build Liberia's relationships with the international community, to negotiate relief from the staggering $4.7 billion debt burden. We established fiscal discipline and enacted regulations which would encourage inward and foreign direct investment. We fixed our roads, paved over 872 kilometers, unlocking the potential of people and goods to move freely across the nation. We invested in social services. Hospitals are now up and running in every county seat in Liberia, and healthcare delivery has been strengthened by training and equipping community healthcare workers. and we have emerged from the deadly Ebola outbreak in 2014 stronger as a nation, but also better prepared to address the next pandemic. Liberia today boasts a diverse and active civil service and a vibrant free press. Sometimes I wonder, freedom without responsibility is something we ought to be careful of. And that, I add to that, social media. With women gaining a greater voice in all aspects of public life, my hope remains that young girls in Liberia and across the continent will refuse to accept limitations imposed upon them by others or by anachronistic cultural practices. Notably, today we are raising a generation of Liberian children who have never known war, who have never seen a gun, and who have never had to run from violent conflict. School enrollment in Liberia have reached nearly 2 million. We have achieved near gender parity in elementary schools and have placed a renewed focus on retaining girls' enrollment through high school. Finally, and more essentially, we have maintained the peace and built a foundation for a sustainable democracy for economic growth. The 2017 elections were not without their challenges. The process was neither smooth nor predictable, but democracy never is. As Nelson Mandela once said, it always seems impossible until it is done. And thus, with all of this, I can claim, with all the imperfections, that Africa has finally seen what a woman president can do, particularly in a fragile post-conflict nation. As commentaries and historians look back at Liberia's historic transition in 2018 and at Liberia's trajectory since our war ended, I hope that they will draw out, among other things, the two priorities I wish to speak to you about today. One, the value of giving young people, especially women, the skills to build a life for themselves and for their families. Two, the critical role of a strong civil service. This is an essential truth. Africa is a youthful continent. Over 65% of the population under the age of 35. Absent economic opportunity and clear dividends from peace and democracy, this so-called youth bulge can become a destabilizing force rather than an enabler of development. In post-conflict nations, especially, it is essential to cultivate an environment that supports productive opportunities for youth. Education, jobs. The young must be empowered with a sense of ownership and responsibility for their own future. It is incumbent upon governments to prioritize entrepreneurship, creating the conditions for young people to see that the path to building a future lies in their own hands. After 30 years of conflict, Liberia was left with a dysfunctional culture where rent-seeking behavior had become a survival skill. I realized after 2 terms in office how difficult it is to change this generational mentality. But we made headway with innovative programs like the economic empowerment of adolescent girls and young women, with the goal of increasing the employment and income of 2,500 young Liberian women by providing life skills training and through supporting their transition into productive work. It proved a worthwhile investment, increasing employment among them by 47% and earnings by 80%. Admittedly, my administration only scratched the surface, and I am hopeful that the new administration will continue this trend. My second point of emphasis is building capacity in government institutions and investing in civil service. As the Woodrow Wilson School was founded on the importance of preparing young people for leadership in public service, I trust this topic will resonate very well with each of you. Having an apolitical class of professionals in place ensures a state continues to function and that it provides citizens with essential services and protection, no matter who is victorious at the ballot box. As the global community seeks to scale innovation and ensure prosperity, civil service reform is a fundamental investment. How can the most innovative technology or healthcare advancements have impact if they cannot be delivered? How can investment be sustained without local resource mobilization and the capacity in the workforce to support it? When I assumed the presidency in Liberia, we knew that Liberia needed a professional civil service in order to thrive. But traditional mistrust in governments and a legacy of corruption in civil service meant that few of Liberia's talented candidates wanted to work in the public service. A bloated and largely unqualified public service, distrustful of changes of any kind, posed a threat to Liberia's fragile peace. So we immediately recruited a small but talented cohort of Liberians responsible for 3 important objectives: creating programs to attract talented civil service candidates from other sectors, developing training programs to build the skills of existing civil servants, and strengthening Liberia's financial backbone by investing in the Ministry of Finance human capacity. While many of these initial efforts relied on expatriate professionals to provide technical assistance in our government, We knew that Liberia's post-conflict situation required a more sustainable and homegrown approach. With support from partners through the Senior Executive Service and Scots Fellow, we introduced a repatriation initiative that brought back home talented Liberians from the diaspora. I launched a program called the President's Young Professional Program in 2009 to recruit and train young Liberians through a 2-year fellowship, which trained them, placed them in the service, preparing for a full career path. By creating a merit-based competitive path to government, the program has countered the prevailing perception that the only pathway into government is through corruption and personal connections. I'm proud to say that this new cadre of young Liberians is leading our country into its next chapter. 90% of the alumni from that program continue to work in government. They have professionalized our core government functions and promoted Liberia's participation in the open government partnership that informs the public on budget and fiscal data. It has demonstrated also new ways that our government can take action when facing unexpected challenges such as Ebola. Other countries in West Africa are now looking to the Liberia example to learn from our experience in successfully attracting high-achieving, purpose-driven young public servants. I hope that other countries will see that youth are not a problem to be solved, but rather a great asset for a rising democracy. You will be proud that an alumni of this university is one of those who conceived and continues to support and expand the President's Young Professional Program and has now taken it across borders, renamed it the Emerging Public Leadership Program. Today, that program is now being launched in Ghana, a much more developed, more capable, with professional people. Let us applaud. Wait a minute, I didn't finish my sentence. I want us to applaud Elizabeth Betsy Williams. An alumni from this university that has taken her knowledge, her training into a passion to be able to support the training, the preparation, the professionalization of young Liberians who can find a career in the civil service. Thank you, Betsy. As other fledgling democracies around the world endeavor for prosperity and growth, it is my hope that they will look to our experience and understand how young leaders are contributing to finding solutions, innovative solutions, in addressing the needs, the aspirations, and the agenda of their nations. Our youths, the young public servants, entrepreneurs, and leaders increasingly play a transformative role as harbingers of peace, and champions of democracy. Let me reassure you, democracy is on the march in Africa. And every day, citizens demand the right to be heard, the right to be active participants in a democratic process. They are leading the advance, and women stand in the forefront. To all of you, let me say how pleased again I am to be here to say that those who have come from our country and from Africa to have come in these halls to be trained in public service are the that go back home and lead the work and lead the effort to be able to professionalize our service. And with that, let's turn to the best part of this program. It's not the speech. It's time for Q&A. And that's when you get the better part of it. Thank you.
Okay, we have 2 microphones. Please line up. And for those of you who've been here before, you know that we like to encourage our students and have them ask questions first.
Hello. Thank you for coming. Very good talk. I had a question for you about, you talked a lot about democracies on the march in Africa, but I would say that a lot of the headline news stories that are coming out of Africa, especially in South Africa and Zimbabwe and a lot of these other countries, there's somewhat of a tension between autocratic rule and the will of the people. So I wonder if you could share your experience on what you think the secret is to breaking that cycle of autocratic rule.
The demands of the young, no question about it. The young are the largest segment of the population in our countries. They're anxious, they're impatient, they're demanding, and they want change. And part of that change is to give them the right of choice. And to get the right of choice means one has to have a system, a constitution, the policies that will enable transition, peaceful, democratic transition from one government to another. Yes, there are still pockets of autocracy in Africa, there's no doubt. You've got 1, 2, 3 places where it's there. But look across the entire continent and you will see the movement. You will see that what Obama called when he went to Ghana, the big man syndrome, no longer exists. Because the demands from the ordinary person are so high that one have to respond to that. It's irreversible.
Thank you.
Madam President, thank you very much for coming. Thank you for giving us a talk that we so desired. I come from Kenya, and when I'm here, as at the moment, I feel I'm from Liberia. So thank you very much for the good tidings from Liberia as well as the mother continent. My question is tied almost to what he asked, and that is the fact that you are coming to power under the recent succession, to me, from Kenya, even though you say they were rough and were not smooth at all. When I look from my angle, they were fairly smooth. They were very, very smooth. So we allowed Liberia for that. But what is your experience that you could suggest to other countries that are struggling with the transition problem? And there are a number of them, even though some are being pushed off, some are proving to be very difficult. We have an example of President Kabila in DRC. We had our own my own country, Kenya, had a problem. We have Museveni wants to be like Xi Jinping, is it? And the same case in Rwanda. What would be your advice on the transition problem of the top seat in Africa?
You know, today, we're truly looking at different democratic approaches in Africa. There are some countries in which we call them managed democracies. Transitions predetermined, as in Botswana, Namibia, to a certain extent, South Africa. We're also looking at the dilemma between the achievement of democratic goals in an environment of autocratic leadership. And what's the trade-off between that of full democracy with competitive arrangements that lead to the exercise of choice? Rwanda, Ethiopia. How does one, it's still a democracy in a certain extent, but it's still not autocratic in certain ways. So the debate is going on within Africa as to, you know, should there be reform in some of our approaches, our transitional ideals? You run into the place, like you mentioned, DR Congo, where a transition is constantly prolonged. And the youths are making demand that could easily lead to total instability and to conflict, violent conflict. There's no smooth process in these things. Tradition and culture have imposed certain systems in certain countries. But the general feeling of democracy, meaning we must have change, we must have the exercise of choice, we must enable ourselves to give other people opportunities. There cannot be a monopolization of power. If you look at the movement of the continent, you will see that there's enough of the good examples as compared with a few bad or questionable examples. And I think the odds are there will be increasing movement toward democratizing those countries that are still falling behind. Because, again, of the pressure that's coming from the youth, from vibrant media, open societies, social media. Many of you in the diaspora are having as much influence on these things as those in the country, because the young one there sit before their computers all night, reading your messages and your influences. So even DRC, in due time, will be forced to democratize.
Good evening, ma'am. So I have a question, and but like a good stool, it sits on 3 legs. So the broad question is basically, you know, you mentioned attracting talented Liberians to come back home and contribute. So the broad question is, how do we expand that to systematically inviting back, you know, the lost children of Africa, you know, the black people in diaspora, and So based on the first leg of which is a country like Haiti applied for African Union membership, how do we approach that? And the second leg is, and did you support it, by the way? Second leg is, given the relationship that America has with the founding of Liberia and America, how does the United States and Liberia form a kinship relationship? Is it through the Congressional Black Caucus, for instance? And the third leg is how is Liberia, how do you think, does Liberia give citizenships to African Americans who, for instance, apply, and should there be such a program?
First, the diaspora going back home. There have been the approaches of institutionalizing the management, if we can call it that, the management of the diaspora through the setting up of offices that increase the information flow. Ghana has done some very interesting things of having, sort of come home day when people from the diaspora can come and can be a part of the scene and can look at opportunities. That has worked, and that has attracted and opened up dual citizenship, is now accepted and promoted in many countries. Mine is still struggling with that. So we now appreciate the contribution of those in the diaspora through remittances. That's being recognized, and that's increasing the pressure to institutionalize the process of exchanges of information. Citizenship you mean for African American? I think it exists in many of our countries. Liberia may be Liberia is not an exception. Liberia is an exception in the other way. I mean, we discriminate against others. That's dual citizenship will help those who want to retain their citizenship for good reasons, but at the same time take citizenship that enable them to be a part of the processes of development and culture in the countries maybe with which they have friends. So it's working in that respect. Was there something else?
Haiti, African Union membership. Did you support it? Should black countries like Haiti
to be a part of the African Union? Oh, they already, I think Jamaica, a few other countries in the Caribbean have been granted associate membership of a sort, and at African Union summits, one or two of them, leaders of the country have spoken, and so that I think one will see much more of that because it's a small world today, and so that's happening.
Good evening, Madam President, former President, Johnson Sirleaf. I'm delighted, been following your work as a journalist. You first decided you wanted one term, and after your first term, you said there were things that you could not complete. So I wonder during your second term whether you completed it during your second term. If not, people are looking at you as you go into a third term through President Weah. Will you clarify that whether there will be a third term with all people electing you of assisting President Weah? And you have created a term called generational change. And when you stated it, people were confused what you meant by that. I think now that you are former president, now you can reflect on it, looking at some of the position that President Weah, young people in his government. Were you preparing President Weah or preparing young leaders as you left office? Will you want to take credit for that, as most of the young people that are in his government today? And lastly, have you spoken to your Vice President, Boyka, because one wonder why you never supported him? Thank you.
Well, no, don't go. Stand there. No, so you can hear the answer. Number one, why I changed to go a second term? Because the Constitution allowed me to. Did I achieve everything I wanted to? No. No one ever achieves everything in those great plans that we make, not individually nor as a nation. Unfortunately, we could have done better if we did not face two shocks. The shock of global conditions and global commodity prices, and the shock of Ebola. And so that drove a 9.5% rate of growth down to zero. And the recovery was just starting. Generational change. Look at the composition of my administration. See all the young people that are holding positions, top positions, running ministries. Am I correct?
Yes.
You don't consider that generational change? So
will you give you credit, take credit that you put that generation change that
oh,
he
yes,
gave our
I do.
president? We are.
Now, when it comes to the politics of who became president, my friend, George Weah ran against me 2 times, and I won. The third time, I was not running. And he won. End of story.
And the last question, whether you have spoken to your vice president, and people look at it as being on in Africa, people usually support the vice president to succeed. Why this went different direction?
That's a different story, requiring an own in-country response. I will not do that here.
Okay.
President Sirleaf.
Madam President.
President Sirleaf, I like your forthrightness. Thank you for making Africa and the world proud of Liberia. I have a two-fold question, maybe unrelated, but one on politics and the other on economics. First question is, in your opinion and experience, practical experience, how would you advise African governments or countries that are considering a 4-year term instead of a 5-year term like we have in Liberia? Ghana has a 4-year term, Liberia has a 5-year term. How would you advise countries like that? And the economic question is, in Liberia's experience and in your own experience, how would you view aid agencies in terms of the way they related to your government in achieving or in making aid to projects in the country? And I will stand here.
What was the last one?
The second question had to do with aid, development assistance, how you view the work of aid agencies in Liberia vis-a-vis the government in terms of supporting projects in the country.
What was the first one again?
First one was, how would you advise African governments to have 4-year terms instead of 5 years?
5-year term. No, I think first of all, Liberia is 6 years.
Oh, even longer.
Yeah. You have, some countries have 7, 6. 4 is the norm. And many countries have been looking for how can you get to the place where we don't get into that second term syndrome. When you get into the second term and the political space is opening, you find everybody campaigning too early. And then the focus and thrust on development gets diminished, or gets lost. So why don't we give it enough, another year, give them a chance to accomplish the goals? But I think that that's going to be demanded by, by the citizens of every country as to how they see that. I mean, we have a constitutional amendment going on in Liberia, which is where the public are really asking us to go back to 4 years. 6 years was established during military rule, and they want to see it come back to 4. And so each country will have to decide that. On the question of aid, the management of aid, quite frankly, takes place essentially by the donor. Yes, you have national agenda. Yes, we ask that support for our national agenda through official development assistance should align with the national agenda, that the priorities should be set by governments themselves and people of the country themselves. There's an attempt to do it. It doesn't really work fully because the donor, the partner, have their own priorities, have their own policies, have their own procedures. And so the only thing one can do is to try to determine some coordinating mechanisms that can bring everybody together and identify certain core things that meet the requirement of both nation and donor. And, I always remind people that the aid that is given, more than 50% goes back to the giver. That didn't ring a bell, eh?
Because it's true. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Madam President, I want to say congratulations, and I'm a Liberian. I'm proud of you. Yeah, it's peaceful, democratic, transferred, and for peace in our country. For 12 good years, we experienced peace, even up to now, and I'm sure that you'll never be forgotten. You'll never be, your legacy will always be remembered in Liberia. I have a couple of questions for you, Madam President. My first question is that I remember when you took office in 2005, you said that you come to reduce corruption, to fight corruption. But I want to know, during your administration, was corruption fought? Or were it minimized? Because we know a couple of people that walk away, that stole a lot of money from the government and they walk away free without you doing anything to them. And my next question is, you said you're going to fight against rape. But we remember a lot of our sisters that our mother was raped on the street and they walk, and people that did it were free. Like Hans William, he was caught for rape, and he was prosecuted for some time, and he was free. And right now he lives in the U.S., he is very free. So we want to know why these people was not prosecuted. And my next question is, I listened to President Weir during his inauguration. He said that the government is broke. You left the government very broke. And then after a few days, you went over there, you said no, you left 440, if I'm making a mistake, 45 million in the government. And we have put an audit committee together, and the Camera report said that only 5 million you left the government. So I want to know whether we are saying the truth, or you saying the truth, or we are lying, or you lying.
Let's deal with the first issue.
Corruption.
No, we did not solve corruption. We could not solve corruption. What we did was to put in those measures to prevent corruption. If not eradication, certainly sharp reduction. And what did we do? One, we established better compensation for civil service to reduce their vulnerabilities. Two, we established laws and policies, acts of legislature. Three, we established integrity institutions, General Auditing Office, the Procurement Office, Anti-Corruption Office. Did that solve it? No. Years of deprivation that have changed the culture, that have emphasized dependency, living by one's wits because of impoverishment. This culture has so been profoundly embedded in the system that it would take some time to solve it. But we have taken the necessary first steps to be able to do that. The other one was?
Rape.
Rape.
Yeah,
Terrible. Yes. One of the areas that will take time to solve. But bear in mind, whereas rape was hidden before, today it's exposed. That's why you know about it, because we bring it to light. It's mentioned in the papers. To be able to resolve it from a culture that comes from the war mentality is something that we must continue to fight. And we always admit that we set up special courts with women as the judge to do that. But poverty is also a restraining factor because, one, the health system that enables to have the means for the evidence of rape. Two is the perpetrator can quickly compromise by offering money and gifts to the family or to the victim. That undermines what we're trying to do. I made rape a non-bailable offense. Never before had that happened. I made it a non-bailable offense. If you're accused of rape, you go to jail immediately.
Yeah, but Madam President, excuse me, your government, a lot of the government officials were accused of raping a lot of our sisters and mother, and they were free aware of that, and which of course I know you are aware of it. And what was it?
We have a judicial system. I don't like it, you don't like it. If somebody went before in a judge and enabled that person to go, we have to keep fighting that and improve the justice system. How long have you been here?
This years? I've been here like 5 years.
Here?
Yeah.
Come back home. Come help us to solve these problems.
Yeah. Madam President, the last question you have not answered concerning the 5 million.
Oh, listen. First of all, you talk about is something this government was under economic strain.
Yeah.
Strain brought about by the conditions, external conditions, and the disease was simply making a climb back. The political environment of the months of campaigning undermined all of the economic effort that was being made because the uncertainty that political environment engendered meant capital flight. It meant cutting down on inputs, the thing that provide the basis. It meant new investment proposals sitting in the legislature, because at that time everybody's thinking politics, nobody's thinking economics anymore. But the 400 million and thing you're talking about was Liberian dollars. You're missing Liberian dollars with US dollars. So that was there, and the US dollar was 6 point something, I think they said 5. Besides, something that they did not acknowledge, that we had completed all the arrangements for a 20 million budget support, which was meant to provide for them to do some new things, and another 7 from the African Development Bank, from the World Bank and African Development Bank. Nobody mentioned that, but that's our effort that will enable them to have a big jump in their first year.
Okay, Madam President, but Madam President, you all right, thank you, Madam President.
No more Liberians. You're monopolizing this event.
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much, Madam President, for being here. It's such an honor. So just for context, I'm a first-year grad student. I'm at Woodrow Wilson School, and the end of the first semester, we do a simulation. And it's very intense, and it's supposed to represent some type of real life issue. And so this simulation, we focused on pandemics and trying to essentially stop a pandemic, much like the pandemic in Liberia. And so going through that process made me realize just the nuances in terms of stopping a pandemic and how difficult it is, and just all the key players, and how it's just a very, very complex process. So just that being said, I'm just curious just to really understand and learn more about your leadership style and how you were able to reassure a nation, stay calm in the face of adversity, when a lot of people, even within your own country and around the world, were in fact not calm. So just would love to hear your reflections on that. And then also, if looking back, if there's any things that you would have done differently or things that you're really proud of in terms of the way that you responded. Thank you.
Our initial response to the pandemic was to restrain movements as a means of preventing people from spreading the disease. That proved wrong. And so we revised our approaches, and then we challenged world projections as to how many people would die within a given period of time. By challenging, we gave our own people hope that we didn't believe those predictions would come true. And then change our approach and put the responsibility for battling the disease in the hands of communities and in the hands of the leaders of communities, so that all the cultural practices to which they were accustomed that was helping to spread the disease could be changed because the leaders were part of it. And so they became first responders, they became the main ones. And that's how we're able to change. Of course, we had a lot of support, in terms of changing the healthcare delivery system, improving our efforts against infection, having better infection control. We did all of those things. And so that's how we're able to get the disease controlled within record time, far beyond the expectations of people as to how long it would take us to solve it. But in spite of that, over 4,000 people died.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for speaking today. Last month, you honored China's ambassador to Liberia, and I wanted to ask you a question about investment. You spoke about aligning donor incentives and your own country's incentives when investment or aid comes in, and I was wondering how you approached China's investment in your country specifically, and how you manage it so productively to have such a great relationship.
China has established an institutional relationship with Africa. It's called the China-Africa Forum. In that forum, China pledges huge sums for African development that any African country can apply for, can use. China's penetration in Africa is very strong. And they do big things that, that have great footprints. And China doesn't have too many conditions for their aid. They don't require you to have election. You want to, be a dictator, so what? So China has been effective in penetrating. But we're also mindful of the bad sides to China's support. The bad sides of bringing in Chinese workers, that undermine our labor systems, that become competitive with some of our small and medium-sized businesses, with the small businesses they try to do around the country. So every country is managing that process in such a way that they don't lose the opportunity for the aid, but at the same time, they don't have China begin to upset some of their own policies and practices. But, it's a real problem. But a penetration is in this country too. I take many things and look at the label and I see made in China.
Thank you very much.
Madam President, thank you so much for coming here and for your speech. So my main concern today is about the electrification rate in Liberia. So when you became president in 2006, the electrification rate in Liberia was under 2%. And last year, this rate slightly increased because the Mount Coffee hydropower station was rehabilitated. So my question is, if we exclude the last 2 years of Ebola crisis, and if we exclude also the shock in commodity prices, why have you waited so long to electrify the country? This is the first question.
To do what?
To electrify the country.
Electrify the country?
Yes. The second question is, considering the fact that electricity is very important for the economy and it's also a basic need for population, do you think that Liberia is attractive for investors today? And my last question is, what should be the main priority for your successor?
First, exchange rate. The exchange rate is supported by the level of reserves, and that comes from your export performance to be able to create those dollars. We still have not reached the level of exports given what happened in the last few years when there have been some, even though we're still exporting, but to reach that level where we could support the currency at the rate we did in the first term of the administration, that became a bit difficult. But the exchange rate rose, the currency depreciated, and managing the exchange rate was a difficult one in the midst of hard currency availability in the central bank. But and then the political uncertainties also added to that. Like I said, there was a certain amount of capital flight that took away from the ability to manage the exchange. But that has been sorted out now, and that situation is now improving. You asked a minute question, I can't remember all. What's that? What?
So the
electricity?
Yes.
But we did bring electricity. That country did not have grid electricity for over 15 years. We brought it. There is electricity. There's electricity in the capital city. It's expanding across our borders. We have 4 of our counties that now, if you go, there's light in Zedru, there's light in Ganta, there's light in Harper. Oh, you from Liberia?
No, I'm from Cameroon.
You don't even know what I'm saying.
But I used to work on Liberia.
Let me put it this way. We have a very good regional power agenda. And so we have had, our hydroelectric was destroyed. The hydroelectric plant has been rebuilt and is now providing. We have other standby units in terms of HFO units that are there. In the rural areas, the different communities I mentioned on the border with Cote d'Ivoire through our regional programs, power is coming from across from Cote d'Ivoire because we don't have the transmission and distribution has been our shortcoming in expanding electricity at the level we want to. Because all of those things were destroyed, the wires, the poles, and everything. It takes time to rebuild that system. But electricity is certainly back. Okay. And we're very proud of the progress we made.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Former President. Unfortunately, I'm the last Liberian in line. but I have a very, very simple question. My question is, what would you do if you had the opportunity of going back to be a president? What is the one thing that you think you would have done better? And secondly, what did you do for education in Liberia during your presidency?
I don't dream. No. Clearly, we would put more emphasis on education, but vocational education. As much as we've done in regular academic institutions, we haven't done enough. And the large percentage of our young people are young people that don't have skills, are young people that don't have an education, many of them coming from the war, many of them child soldiers who never had the opportunity to go to school. And unless they have the skills to be able to protect their livelihood and protect and their family, it would be difficult. So yes, as the experience of many countries, education is the key in all countries to build that capacity and that capability to be able to move things. But there is no quick fix in education. It's going to be a progressive, continually increasing effort to be able to educate a population. When a country with a high level of illiteracy, again, literacy programs that bring them to a different level to enable them to do skills and benefit more effectively from skills are all part of the things that we did. Some of it, not enough of it, and if one had to do it again, we concentrated a lot on what we call the hard areas, you know, the roads and the electricity and the water. And so I think if one were doing some shifting now, you go into not necessarily economic infrastructure, but social infrastructure, education systems and health systems leave much to be done and improved upon.
Thank you.